His mistress smiled as she testified against her. His family laughed when the lawyer called her unfit. Her husband smirked, thinking he'd finally won custody. Then a man in a suit whispered to the judge. One document changed everything. The broken woman they destroyed had just become their billionaire boss. The courtroom was cold that morning. Not just cold in temperature, but cold in the way only places of judgment can be. The kind of cold that settles in your chest when you know you're about to lose everything. Celeste Warren sat alone on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She wore a simple navy dress that had seen better days. The hem was coming loose at the bottom, her shoes were scuffed, her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but a few strands had fallen loose, and framing a face that looked 10 years older than her 32 years. Across the aisle on the other side of that cold courtroom sat her husband Darius. He looked like success, tailored gray suit, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, shoes polished to a mirror shine. Next to him sat Simone Devon, 28 years old and beautiful in the way that turns heads and breaks hearts. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Celeste's monthly rent. Her hand rested on Darius's arm, a claim of ownership that made Celeste's stomach turn. Behind them in the gallery sat Darius's parents. Diane Warren wore pearls and judgment in equal measure. Her husband Roland sat rigid beside her, his face set in an expression of permanent disappointment. They whispered to each other, shooting glances at Celeste like she was something dirty they'd stepped in on the street. Judge Helena Thornton sat at the bench, a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her natural hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked tired, like she'd seen too many families tear themselves apart in this room. She shuffled papers and waited for the proceedings to begin. Celeste clutched a worn leather folder in her lap. It had been delivered to her apartment late last night by courier. She hadn't opened it yet. She was too tired, too broken, too defeated to care what was inside. It could wait. Everything could wait. Right now, all she could think about was her son, Elijah, 7 years old, with his father's smile and her sensitive heart. The boy she'd raised while Darius built his real estate empire. The boy she'd protected and loved while Darius slowly fell out of love with her and into the arms of someone younger, prettier, more ambitious. The lawyer stood up. His name was Mr. Stevens, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and a voice that dripped with practiced sympathy. He worked with Thornton and Associates, and the firm handling the case. He began speaking, and every word felt like a knife. "Your Honor," Stevens said, his voice filling the courtroom. "The evidence will show that Mrs. Warren is simply not fit to be the primary caregiver for young Elijah. She works long hours as a legal secretary at a struggling downtown firm. She makes barely enough to cover rent in a cramped one-bedroom apartment. Since the death of her grandfather 3 months ago, she's been emotionally unstable, withdrawn, unable to provide the stable home environment that a child needs. Celeste wanted to speak, wanted to scream that she worked those long hours to feed her son because Darius had stopped sending support payments 6 months ago, wanted to explain that the apartment was small because Darius had emptied their joint account before filing for divorce. Nay wanted to tell them that she wasn't unstable. She was grieving the only family member who'd ever truly loved her. But the words stuck in her throat. She stayed silent. Stevens continued, "My client, Mr. Darius Warren, has a stable income, a 3-bedroom home in a good neighborhood, and the support of his family. More importantly, he has Miss Simone Devon, a successful marketing executive who has expressed her willingness to provide a maternal presence in Elijah's life." At the mention of her name, Simone shifted slightly in her seat. She looked at Celeste, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes. Not pity, not sympathy, satisfaction, like she'd won a prize. Judge Thornton looked at Celeste over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Warren, do you have legal representation?" Celeste's voice came out barely above a whisper. "No, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Darius leaned back in his chair and the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close, like a man who just realized the game was already over. The judge frowned. "Mrs. Warren, do you understand the seriousness of these proceedings?" This is a custody hearing. Your parental rights are at stake. Yes, Your Honor, Celeste said softly. I understand. Then I strongly advise you to seek legal counsel. I'm willing to grant a continuance. No. Celeste said, no continuance. Let's just get this over with. Stephen smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Your Honor, if it pleases the court, we'd like to call our first witness. And so it began. The systematic destruction of Celeste Warren. First came the neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an older woman who lived in Celeste's building. She testified that Celeste always looked tired, always looked sad, that she'd heard the child crying sometimes late at night, that Celeste rarely smiled anymore. She's a good woman, Mrs. Patterson said, almost apologetically, but she seems lost, like she's drowning. Next came Darius's brother, Kenneth. He was younger than Darius, sharper around the edges. He testified that he'd visited Darius's old house several times before the separation and witnessed Celeste neglecting Elijah. The boy was always watching television, Kenneth said, never doing homework, never playing outside. It was a lie, and Celeste knew it. Kenneth had visited exactly twice in 7 years, both times drunk, both times asking Darius for money. But what could she say? Who would believe her? Then came Diane Warren, Darius's mother. She walked to the witness stand like she owned it, head high, pearls gleaming. She swore her oath with one hand on the Bible and the other adorned with rings that cost more than Celeste made in a year. Stevens asked her about Celeste's character. Diane didn't hesitate. That girl trapped my son with a pregnancy. I said it then, I'll say it now. She was a nobody from nowhere, and she saw Darius as her ticket out. She got pregnant on purpose, and my son, being the honorable man he is, married her. But she's never been right for our family. She doesn't fit. She doesn't belong. In the gallery, Roland Warren nodded along with every word his wife said. And since her grandfather died, Diane continued, she's been worse, distant, cold. The boy needs stability, Your Honor. He needs a real home with a real family, not some broken woman living in an apartment that's barely fit for one person, let alone two. When Diane stepped down, she walked past Celeste without looking at her. Back in the gallery, she whispered something to Roland. They both chuckled softly, like this was entertainment, but the worst was yet to come. Stevens called Simone Devon to the stand. Simone rose gracefully, smoothed her cream dress, and walked to the witness box like she was gliding across water. She sat down, crossed her ankles, folded her hands in her lap. The picture of poise, the picture of someone who had never been broken. Miss Devon, Stevens said gently, can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Warren and his son? Simone's voice was soft, warm, almost maternal. Of course, Darius and I have been together for about 8 months now. I know that's not a long time, but in that time, I've gotten to know Elijah very well. He's a wonderful, sensitive boy who deserves so much love. She paused, glanced at Celeste, and in that glance was everything unsaid. The triumph, the theft, the absolute certainty that she'd won. I've spent weekends with Elijah during Darius's visitation time, Simone continued. I've helped with homework, made meals, tucked him in at night, and I've seen how confused he is, how sad. He talks about his mother, of course, but he also talks about how she's always tired, always stressed. He told me once that he's scared she might leave him like his great-grandfather did. It was a knife, and Simone knew exactly where to twist it. I love that boy, Simone said, and her eyes actually welled with tears. Fake tears, but convincing ones. I want to give him the stability he needs, the love he deserves. And I want to be there for him in ways that, well, in ways that his mother simply can't be right now. Simone smiled then, not at the judge, not at Stevens, at Celeste. A soft, gentle smile that said, I've won. Behind them, Diane Warren covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders shook with barely suppressed laughter. Roland shook his head slowly like he was watching something pitiful. Celeste felt something crack inside her chest. She stared down at the table, at her worn hands, at the leather folder in her lap. She felt small. She felt invisible. She felt like nothing. Judge Thornton asked if Celeste had any questions for the witness. Celeste shook her head. Stevens smiled again. Your Honor, we have additional witnesses if needed, but I believe the picture is quite clear. Mrs. Warren is simply not capable of providing. I need a recess, Celeste said suddenly. Her voice was louder than she intended, echoing in the quiet courtroom. Please, Your Honor, just 15 minutes. Judge Thornton studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 15-minute recess. We'll reconvene at 10:30. The gavel came down. Celeste walked to the courthouse bathroom like a ghost. Her legs felt weak. Her hands trembled. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. She pushed open the door, grateful to find it empty. She went to the sink, gripped the cold porcelain edge, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed, thin, exhausted, broken. When had she become this person? When had she stopped being Celeste Mitchell, the little girl who played chess on her grandfather's porch and turned into Celeste Warren, the woman everyone pied? She touched the small silver pendant at her throat, a tiny gavel worn smooth with age. Her grandfather had given it to her when she was 10 years old. Real power is quiet, he'd told her. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it speaks once. And the whole room listens. She'd worn it every day since. Through college, through her wedding, through Elijah's birth, through the slow, painful death of her marriage, through her grandfather's funeral 3 months ago. She missed him so much, it physically hurt. Judge Lawrence Mitchell had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 5. He'd been a small-town judge in rural North Carolina, respected but not wealthy. At least that's what everyone thought. He'd lived in a modest house, drove an old car, wore the same 3 suits to court for 20 years. But he'd loved her with a fierceness that made up for every loss, every absence, every wound. He'd taught her chess on the front porch, explaining that life was like the game. You don't always have to move fast, he'd said. Sometimes the smartest move is to wait, to let your opponent think they've won. And then, when they're not looking, you move your queen into position. Checkmate. She remembered meeting Darius in college. She'd been 19, studying to be a paralegal, working 2 jobs to pay tuition. Where Darius had been charming, ambitious, full of big dreams about building a real estate empire. He'd pursued her with flowers and late-night conversations and promises of a future together. She'd fallen hard. They'd married young. She'd gotten pregnant with Elijah a year later. She'd dropped out of school to support Darius's dreams, working as a legal secretary while he built his business. And for a while, it had been good. They'd been happy, hadn't they? But somewhere along the way, Darius had started looking at her differently, like she was a weight around his neck, like she was something he'd outgrown. His business took off, and suddenly he was making real money, meeting successful people, attending events where her worn dresses and quiet nature didn't fit. He started coming home late. I started taking business trips that lasted longer than they should, started smiling at his phone in ways he never smiled at her. Then came Simone, beautiful, ambitious, polished Simone, who worked in marketing for one of Darius's corporate clients. Celeste had suspected for months before she'd known for sure. The late nights, the distance, the way he'd stopped touching her, stopped looking at her, stopped seeing her at all. When he'd finally asked for a divorce 6 months ago, part of her had been relieved. At least the pretending could stop. But then he'd come for Elijah, filed for full custody. And that's when Celeste realized that Darius didn't just want to leave her. He wanted to erase her, to take the one good thing in her life and claim it as his own. Her grandfather had died 3 months ago, heart attack sudden and devastating. She'd held his hand in the hospital as he slipped away, and his last words to her had been, "You're stronger than you know, baby girl. Don't let them make you forget that." The funeral had been small, just a handful of people from town, a few old colleagues. Celeste, drowning in grief. I hadn't noticed the well-dressed men standing in the back of the church, watching her with careful eyes. Now, standing in this courthouse bathroom, looking at her broken reflection, Celeste felt like she had nothing left. No husband, no family, no grandfather. Soon, maybe no son. She looked down at the leather folder she'd carried into the bathroom with her, the one delivered last night by courier. She'd been too tired to open it, too defeated to care. But something in her whispered, "Open it now." Her hands shook as she unclasped the old brass closure. Inside were documents, legal papers with official seals and signatures, and a letter handwritten on cream stationery in her grandfather's careful script. She began to read. "My dearest Celeste, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just endured 3 months of probate hell waiting for my estate to settle. I'm sorry for that, baby girl, but it was necessary to make sure everything was airtight, legally sound, impossible to challenge. You're of the woodwork, trying to claim what's of the woodwork, trying to claim what's mine. And I wanted you to see who truly had your back when they thought you had nothing. By now you know I lived simply that little house in North Carolina. The old car, the modest judge's salary. What you don't know is that for 50 years I invested every spare dollar into building something bigger, much bigger. I started with one small law firm, then another, then another. I was careful. I used shell companies, trusts, offshore accounts. I didn't want anyone knowing who really controlled these firms. I didn't want fame or recognition. I wanted power. Real power. The kind that changes lives. I'm Mitchell and Stone Legal Group. Maybe you've heard of it. One of the most powerful law firms in the country. Corporate law, criminal defense, family law, civil rights. 47 firms under one umbrella. Worth approximately $92 billion. It's yours, Celeste. All of it. As of 8 o'clock this morning, you became the sole owner and CEO of Mitchell and Stone Legal Group. You own the firm you work for. You own the building you work in. You own firms in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston. You own boutique practices that represent Fortune 500 companies. You own public defenders' offices that fight for people who can't afford justice. And you own Thornton and Associates, the firm handling your custody case. I wish I could be there to see the look on their faces when they realize, when your husband realizes. When that woman sitting next to him realizes, when his family realizes that the broken, poor, pathetic woman they're destroying in that courtroom is actually the billionaire who controls their entire world. Remember what I taught you, baby girl. Real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it speaks once and everyone listens. Your moment is now. Make me proud. All my love, Grandpa Lawrence Celeste read the letter 3 times. Her hands stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. She looked up at the mirror again, and this time, the woman looking back at her wasn't broken. She was awake. She carefully folded the letter, placed it back in the folder with the legal documents, and walked out of the bathroom with her head held high. When court reconvened at 10:30, Celeste walked back to her seat with something different in her step. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but if anyone had been paying attention, they would have noticed that her hands weren't shaking anymore. But nobody was paying attention to Celeste. Why would they? She'd already lost. Judge Thornton resumed her seat at the bench. Darius leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. He whispered something to Simone, and she giggled softly, covering her mouth with her hand. In the gallery, Diane and Roland Warren watched with satisfied expressions, like people watching the end of a movie they'd already seen. Stephen stood up, ready to call Celeste to the stand for cross-examination, ready to finish what he'd started, ready to destroy whatever credibility she had left. "Your Honor," he began, "the defense would like to." The courtroom doors opened, everyone turned. A man walked in, 65 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the entire furniture in this courtroom. His shoes made no sound on the tile floor, but his presence filled the room like thunder. Behind him came 3 more people, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed impeccably, all carrying leather briefcases, all moving with the absolute confidence of people who owned every space they entered. The silver-haired man walked directly toward the bench. The bailiff stepped forward, but the man simply showed him credentials. The bailiff's eyes widened, and he stepped aside. Darius sat up straighter. Simone's smile faded. Stevens looked confused. The man reached the bench and leaned close to Judge Thornton. He spoke softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. While he spoke, he handed her a document. Judge Thornton's face changed. First confusion, then shock, then something that looked almost like fear. She took the document with hands that suddenly seemed unsteady. She read it once, then again. Her eyes went wide. She looked up at the man. Then she looked at Celeste. For the first time all day, Judge Helena Thornton looked at Celeste Warren and really saw her. The courtroom was silent. Darius's relaxed posture was gone. He sat forward, watching the judge, watching the silver-haired man, trying to understand what was happening. Her Simone had gone pale. Diane Warren grabbed her husband's arm, confusion written all over her face. Judge Thornton cleared her throat. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, more careful. "Mr. Hamilton," she said slowly, "could you please confirm for the record what you just told me?" The silver-haired man turned to face the courtroom. His voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your Honor, my name is Jerome Hamilton. I'm the senior partner and executive of the estate of Judge Lawrence Mitchell. I'm here to inform this court that as of 8 o'clock this morning, Mrs. Celeste Warren became the sole legal owner and CEO of Mitchell and Stone Legal Group." Silence, complete, total silence, Jerome continued, and every word landed like a bomb. A Mitchell and Stone Legal Group is one of the largest law firm conglomerates in the United States. It owns and operates 47 law firms across the country, specializing in corporate law, criminal defense, civil rights, and family law. The company is valued at approximately $92 billion. Gasps, whispers. Darius sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. "I'm here today," Jerome said, his voice never rising, but somehow filling every corner of the courtroom. "Because Mitchell and Stone Legal Group owns Thornton and Associates, the firm currently presiding over this custody case, which means, Your Honor, that Mrs. Celeste Warren is your employer. She owns this firm. She owns this building. She has owned it since this morning, though she only learned of this fact during recess." The room exploded with whispers. Darius's face had gone from confident to confused, to pale in the space of 30 seconds. Simone had pulled her hand away from his arm. Stevens looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Jerome turned slightly, his eyes finding Darius and Simone. When he spoke again, his voice was ice, which means that every word spoken against Mrs. Warren today, every insult, and every accusation, every attempt to paint her as unfit was spoken in her own courtroom by her own employees about the woman who now controls their professional futures. Diane Warren made a small sound in the back of her throat. Roland had gone completely still. Judge Thornton stood, her face ashen. "Mr. Hamilton, are you saying that Mrs. Warren—" "I'm saying, Your Honor, that Mrs. Warren is one of the most powerful people in the legal world as of this morning. I'm saying that Judge Lawrence Mitchell spent 50 years building this empire in silence, and he left every single piece of it to his granddaughter. I'm saying that the woman everyone in this room dismissed as poor, broken, and unfit is actually a billionaire who owns the very system they're using to attack her." For the first time all day, Celeste stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at Darius. His face was white, all the confidence, all the swagger, all the certainty gone. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Celeste's voice when she finally spoke was soft but steady. Each word carried weight. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a continuance. I need time to review exactly who in this courtroom is employed by my firms, and then I need to decide if they still will be." She let that hang in the air for a moment. Then she turned her gaze to Simone. Simone, who had smiled so sweetly on the witness stand. Simone, who had testified about loving Elijah, about wanting to be his mother. Simone, who had looked at Celeste with such triumph just an hour ago. Now Simone couldn't meet her eyes. Celeste looked at Diane Warren, at Roland, at Stevens, at all of them. "I also need to consult with my legal team," she said quietly. about whether any ethical violations occurred today, and such as employees using company resources and connections to attack the owner of the company they work for, such as witnesses giving false testimony, such as lawyers filing frivolous cases on behalf of clients who clearly don't have their child's best interests at heart. Jerome stepped forward. Mrs. Warren, if I may clarify for the court, Judge Thornton is indeed employed by your firm, as is the court reporter in this room. And he glanced at Stevens. Mr. Stevens over there is a contracted attorney who works frequently with Thornton and Associates on family law referrals. Stevens looked like he might pass out. Darius finally found his voice. Celeste. Wait. I didn't know. We didn't. You didn't know, Celeste said, and her voice was still soft, still calm, but underneath it was steel. Because you never asked, you never cared to ask. You assumed I was nothing. You all did. She reached up and touched the small silver gavel pendant at her throat. My grandfather spent 50 years building this empire in silence. He taught me that real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't fight for respect. She looked around the courtroom, meeting every eye that had judged her that morning. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it speaks once. She paused. I'm speaking now. The next 2 weeks moved like a storm. Judge Thornton immediately recused herself from the case due to obvious conflict of interest. The custody hearing was suspended and reassigned to a different court in a different district. This time, Celeste showed up with a team of lawyers from Mitchell and Stone that made Stevens look like a first-year law student. The new judge took one look at the evidence, the real evidence, not the manufactured narrative, and awarded Celeste full custody. Darius got supervised visitation only 2 hours every Sunday with a social worker present. Darius's real estate business began to crumble almost immediately. The word spread fast in business circles. People talked. They always talked. The man who tried to destroy his wife in her own courtroom without even knowing it. The man who'd been so arrogant he never bothered to ask where his wife came from, who her family was, what she might become. Clients pulled out. Clients. Partners distanced themselves. Deals fell through. Within a month, Darius Warren's empire was in ruins. His parents, Diane and Roland, found their social circle shrinking fast. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The people they'd laughed with, the community they'd built their status on, all of it crumbled because nobody wanted to be associated with the family that had publicly humiliated a billionaire. Simone disappeared like smoke. She stopped answering Darius's calls within 3 days of the courtroom revelation. She'd never loved him. She'd loved what he represented, success, money, status. With all of that gone, so was she. Worse, Simone worked in marketing for a company called Prestige Partners. They did significant business with Mitchell and Stone's corporate clients. And that business relationship quietly ended 2 weeks after the court incident. Simone's bosses didn't fire her immediately. They didn't have to. They just made her life miserable until she quit. She left the city entirely. Last anyone heard, she was in another state, starting over with a different name on her resume. Stevens, the lawyer who'd so confidently dismantled Celeste's character, found his contract with Thornton and Associates, quietly terminated. He could still practice law, but the referrals dried up. Other firms noticed. Word got around. His reputation took a hit he'd never fully recover from. Judge Helena Thornton kept her position after a long private meeting with Celeste. Nobody knew exactly what was said in that meeting, but after it, Judge Thornton's rulings became notably more compassionate toward struggling mothers, more skeptical of wealthy husbands with powerful families. Celeste had been merciful, but she'd made her point. Integrity mattered now. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, Darius showed up at the Mitchell and Stone headquarters building. It was a stunning high-rise in downtown, all glass and steel and power. He walked into the lobby in jeans and a wrinkled shirt, looking nothing like the confident man who'd smirked in court. Security stopped him immediately. "I need to see Celeste Warren," he said. "Please, I just need to talk to her." The security guard, a professional woman in her 40s, checked her computer. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No, but I'm her husband, ex-husband. I just need 5 minutes. The woman made a call, listened, hung up. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. I'm sorry, sir. Mrs. Warren is not available. If you need to communicate regarding your son, please direct all inquiries through the legal team. To ask you to leave. Darius stood there to ask you to leave. Darius stood there in that pristine lobby, surrounded by marble and money and power, and something in him broke. His shoulders sagged, his eyes filled with tears. He nodded slowly and turned toward the door. As security escorted him out, he passed a wall of photographs, company history, and there in the center was a black and white photo of Judge Lawrence Mitchell shaking hands with city officials at some long-ago ceremony. The caption read, Founder Mitchell and Stone Legal Group, 1975. Darius stared at that photo for a long moment. This man, this judge, Celeste's grandfather, he'd built all of this. And Darius had never even asked about him. I had never cared to know where Celeste came from, who her family was, what legacy she carried. He'd been married to her for over 8 years, and he'd never really seen her at all. Security walked him to the street. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the building, and then he walked away into the crowd. The saddest part came with Elijah. The boy was 7 years old enough to understand more than adults realized. He'd heard about what his father did. Kids at school talked, their parents talked, and Elijah, sensitive and smart like his mother, understood betrayal, even if he couldn't fully name it. On their first supervised visit, Elijah was quiet. He answered his father's questions with short words. Yes. No. Okay. He didn't smile, didn't run to hug him, didn't light up the way he used to. Darius tried everything. I brought toys, promised trips to the zoo, to the movies, to anywhere Elijah wanted. But the boy just looked at him with old eyes and a young face. Did you really try to take me away from Mom? Elijah asked during their third visit. Darius froze. Buddy, it's complicated. To love more than anything, now looked at to love more than anything, now looked at him like a stranger. And that hurt more than losing his business, more than losing his status, more than all of it combined. Because Darius realized too late that he hadn't fought for Elijah out of love. He'd fought for Elijah to hurt Celeste, to win, to prove he could, and in winning nothing, he'd lost everything. 6 months passed, like water under a bridge. Celeste stood on the front porch of her grandfather's old house in rural North Carolina. She'd had it restored, the wood painted fresh, the roof replaced, the garden cleaned up, but she'd kept it simple the way he'd liked it. No mansion, no showpiece. When a child feels safe again. His laugh when a child feels safe again. His laugh sounded like music. Celeste had moved Mitchell and Stone's headquarters, but kept a modest office. She didn't need the big corner suite. She worked hard, but differently than the old guard expected. She funded legal aid programs for women escaping bad marriages. She created scholarships for students from poor families who wanted to study law. She made sure that public defenders in her firms had the resources they needed to fight for people who couldn't afford justice. She didn't flaunt her wealth, didn't give interviews, didn't appear on magazine covers or attend galas unless absolutely necessary. She ran her empire the way her grandfather had taught her, quietly, powerfully, with dignity. She thought about his words often. Real power is quiet. People in town still didn't really know who she was. They knew her as Lawrence Mitchell's granddaughter, the one who'd inherited his house. They didn't know about the billions, the empire, the firms. She liked it that way. Sometimes late at night, she'd sit on the porch in the same rocking chair her grandfather had used, and she'd remember their chess games, the patience he'd taught her, the strategy, the long game. You don't always have to move fast, he'd said. Sometimes the smartest move is to wait. She'd waited, and when the moment came, she'd moved once. Checkmate. A letter arrived one Tuesday afternoon, hand-delivered by courier. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Darius. It was the 15th letter he'd sent. She hadn't opened any of them. She took this one, like all the others, and placed it in a drawer in her grandfather's old desk. Maybe one day she'd read them, maybe not. Right now, she didn't need his apologies or explanations or justifications. She had her son. She had her peace. She had her purpose. That was enough. Elijah ran up to the porch, breathless and happy. "Mom, did you see? I caught 3 fireflies." She smiled. A real smile. The first one that reached her eyes in months. "I saw a baby. You were amazing. Can we play chess tonight like great-grandpa taught you?" "Of course we can." That evening, as the sun set over North Carolina and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Celeste taught her son the game her grandfather had taught her. She showed him how each piece moved, how patience mattered, how sometimes you had to sacrifice to win, how the queen was the most powerful piece on the board. "Remember," she told him, setting up the pieces, "real power isn't about being loud. It's about being smart. It's about waiting for the right moment." Elijah nodded seriously, studying the board, and as Celeste watched her son learn the lessons that would carry him through life, she felt her grandfather's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. She touched the silver gavel pendant at her throat and whispered, "I made you proud, Grandpa." The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance she heard the sound of wind chimes. It sounded almost like laughter. Some people spend their whole lives chasing power. Others are born into it but waste it. And then there are people like Celeste who never knew they had it until the moment they needed it most. Her grandfather was right. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg. It doesn't fight for attention. It just is. And when it finally speaks, everyone listens.